So, like I said, on the weekly overview, which is where all the stuff for this class is, I'll put the Monday stuff first, and then the homework, and then there'll be the Wednesday stuff next. So here's what we'll do in class for homework. The Wednesday stuff may be kind of sparse, like if you're looking at it ahead of time, like on Monday, if you're looking at Wednesday stuff, I may add and update it when we get to Wednesday, just because this is my first year teaching like AP. I've taught juniors before and like the stuff they were doing, but like at a lower level, right? So sometimes I need time to adjust. And then also like the 1 hour schedule is really rough because like for the last 8 years I've been on a 90-minute track now. Anyway, so sometimes it takes me just a second to like really update that next one. So try to be patient with me. I'm trying to be patient with you. And I'll post those videos at the end of Monday. Like I'll post it here in case you were gone. And same with Wednesday. I'll post it after that, so that way if you get quarantined, you still can know what we're doing. Any questions on like the phase 2 stuff? Basically, I don't know anything. I know like what you know, but maybe I'm a better listener sometimes. I don't know. Okay, so on the weekly overview is a sheet that I want you to click on. It's the Huckleberry Finn class discussion notes page. That's a lot of words. You do not need to turn this in, but you will take a Huckleberry Finn final. I think like December 3rd or 4th, one of those like early December days. And so I have for you just a note list of all the important things that you need to know before you take that final. So you can take notes as we're talking in class. So last time in class, oh, it's still unfrozen. Last time in class, we kind of briefly went over Huck as narrator. We talked a little bit about religion and some of the hypocrisy there. We're going to keep taking, we were supposed to take notes on this last time, but then we had to take that really fun survey that was, I'm sure, super useful. And then we talked about PAC. So you could either like transfer your notes to one document so that you've got it all there for your notes, or you could just remind yourself that like, oh yeah, we took these notes on this assignment, so that when you go back to study, you remember where those notes are. So that's up to you. But yeah, so again, you're not going to turn this sheet in, but I would take notes here because that final is coming at the end. About half the points on the final are just, did you do your reading? Did you read all of it? So just make sure that, if nothing else, you're keeping up with your reading. And that's like half the points right there, okay? Any questions on that? Okay. So, number 3 here says Huck and Thomas foil figures, realism versus romanticism. So we're going to look at romanticism versus realism really quick. And you can add notes to there if you want. I'm not going to tell you precisely what to take notes on. I might be like, this is important and stuff, but when you get to college, your professors won't tell you anything. They'll be like, I don't care if you take notes. And then they'll give you the final. You'll be like, oh gosh, I wish I had taken notes, right? So make sure that you're taking notes and stuff so that you can remember what they are if you're a bad rememberer. So romanticism and realism are both literary movements. And what that means is literature started to have these commonalities during specific periods of time. And so romanticism came first. It was about the turn of the 19th century, so from the 1800s to the 1850s. They were obsessed with happy endings, right? So they would have like, oh, these wistful trials, and then at the end they'd all get married, or they'd all end up happy and rich, or whatever. Okay? They emphasized the idea of beauty, and creation and originality were prized. And often they would defy conventions and rules. So basically, I think that the reason that this was such a big movement at this period of time is because this was not a very fun time for humans. We still didn't have a lot of the industrialized processes that we do later on as we get to the end of this time period. A lot of people still die from diseases. It's right after like the 1700s, which is kind of where the Enlightenment starts. So they're trying to make life feel more beautiful than it actually is. And they emphasize these things to create that beauty and have things to look forward to. Romantic characters, people like Anne of Green Gables is a very romantic character, right? She takes everything and is like, oh, like, I can't remember what the pond is called, like Barker's Pond or whatever. That's an ugly name. Let's call it the Lake of Shining Waters, like, right? So she takes everything and she kind of romanticizes it. Other romantics, Disney is full of romanticism, right? And then after this movement, so about the 1850s, people were getting sick of looking at these beautiful worlds, things that kind of weren't achievable at all, right? And so realism is a reaction to Romanticism. It picks up kind of the end of the 1800s and going into the 1900s. You see a lot of realism. We also see a lot of industrialization at this time. So you've got people working like 12-hour shifts, right? And they're working in factories, doing assembly line stuff, not very glorious work, right? It's a rejection of Romanticism and idealization, and they focus on life as it is and the beauty of that. So they're not just trying to make things look ugly. They're just like, why are we projecting these perfect worlds when, you know, that's not what our life is like? We want to see life as it is and see that that is beautiful in its own way, right? So they emphasize truth rather than like idealization. And they don't focus on the ugly parts of life, but they refuse to avoid them, right? So you get, I think, Dickens has a little bit of Romanticism in it still, but he also focuses on the realistic aspects of factory life as well. And so in a lot of his books, we get like the contrast between the two. Howells was a realist. Mark Twain is a realist, so we'll see. He really loves realism and hates Romanticism with a fiery passion. Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle about industrialization and factory life, and that's realism. But basically, they're just, again, sick of these fairy tales that are never going to happen in their lives. And so we're going to portray life as it is and see that that is beautiful in its own way. Any questions so far? It's kind of a very general overview of the two movements. Okay, so some pictures. Here we have the Disney romantic princesses. You'll notice that they all have sparkly dresses and tiny waists and big eyes and perfect hair. Right? These are not achievable. We have the Disney princes as well. They pretty much look like the same with different hair. So, and different costumes depending on where they're from. So these are very romantic, right? Pretty unachievable. Although I'd like to have pants that look as pillowy as Aladdin's here. That would be nice. Okay, so then an artist decided to take pictures of realist princesses and stories. So here we have Snow White. She's got a husband just watching TV, and I wish that this artist would put 7 different people in there, because then it would have been like the 7 dwarfs. So for like my own heart, that makes me feel a little bit sad, but she's got all her little dwarfs, right? They're all crying and sad. We've got Cinderella. She's very sad and lonely. Life isn't what she thought it was going to be. Rapunzel, the cancer patient, because nobody has hair that long. Very sad. We got Not So Little Red Riding Hood. Jasmine, she went in the Middle East. Sad. Beauty, right? So Belle. This is the standard today. Got Pocahontas, the cat lady. So that is not very exciting. And then I just thought that was weird looking. So if he was real, that's what he would look like. But a lot of our cartoons, our fairy tales, are very romanticized and not real. So Mark Twain hated romantics. He thought it was ridiculous. And so here's a little piece where he's talking about the leather stocking tales, and specifically within that, the book called Deerslayer. So James Fenimore Cooper, he wrote like these frontier books, and they're kind of some of the first frontier books in American history, so they're talking about that. And Mark Twain hated them, because Mark Twain grew up in the South, kind of in this frontier area because it's small, and he's like, this is not real at all. And so he writes like this, almost like treatise of like why it sucks. And you'll see how much he hates romanticism. So he says, a work of art, it has no invention, it has no order, system, sequence, or result. It has no life-likeness, no thrill, no stir, no seeming of reality. Its characters are confusedly drawn, and by their acts and words they prove that they are not the sort of people the author claims they are. Its humor is pathetic. Its pathos is funny. Its conversations are indescribable. Its love seems odious. Its English a crime against the language. So very harsh critiques. And then he goes on and he details a list of all of the defects. So he says that there are 19 rules, or that people have established that for fiction there are 19 rules. some people say 22, and in Deerslayer, Cooper violated 18 of the 19 or 22. And then he details a list of all the things that he sucked at. He says, 1, a tale should accomplish something and arrive somewhere, but the Deerslayer tale accomplishes nothing and arrives in air. So it has no point. The plot sucks. I think one of my favorites is this third one down here, but this is covering up. Go away. Maybe it won't go away. But it says that they require that personages in a tale shall be alive, except in the cases of corpses, and that always the reader shall be able to tell the corpses from the others. But this detail has often been overlooked in the Deerslayer tale. So he's like, the characters are so boring, you can't tell them from the dead people. Which I just think is funny. So he rages on, and by the end he's just like bolded list. Eschew surplusage, don't omit necessary details, use good grammar. Anyway, he hates it. Okay, and we see that in Huck Finn as well. And one of the ways that he shows that he hates romanticism and tries to put realism on like a kind of pedestal is his foil between Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. So thinking about these two boys, what are they like? What is Tom Sawyer like versus what is Huck Finn like? I can give us a brief synopsis. There are more of you, so I should see more people participating. All right, let's ask Beckett. What is Huck Finn like versus what is Tom Sawyer like?
Tom Sawyer is kind of like more troublemaker, and then Huck Finn, it's not as much.
Like he goes along with it, but whose ideas are these?
It's Tom Sawyer.
They're Tom's ideas. And what kind of ideas does he have? What does he like to do? He likes to do some violent things, right? But he says it's under the guise of like play, right? So they have this gang, right? And what does their gang do? Well, they're supposed to be like pirates, and they're like, okay, we're going to go around, and we're going to steal stuff, and we're going to ambuscade people. He says ambuscade. I think the more common term is ambush for that, right? But I guess ambuscade is actually a word, though very archaic. And so one of the people that they ambush is this Sunday picnic, right? So they've got like the Sunday school out, and they run amok, and they're trying to find stuff. And the boys are like, all right, we're ready. He's like, we're going to steal camels, we're going to steal gold. And they get there, and they're like, there's nothing to steal. But Tom's like, can't you see it, right? And so he's got like these big ideas, and takes everything and kind of romanticizes it, right? Whereas like Huck Finn is like, all right, I'll go along with it because I'm like, seems like Tom is more fun than me, but he wouldn't come up with this stuff on his own. Like when he is with his pack, right, and he's trying to escape, he makes it look like he's died, and he's like, Tom could do such a better job than me, but I'm just, doing it quick and dirty so it looks like I'm dead. Yeah?
Wait, was he talking about Tom or Mark Twain?
He doesn't talk about Mark Twain except for in the beginning right there, but he talks about Tom, how Tom Sawyer would do this better.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Twain is right. But yeah, he's like, he could do such a better job, but I'm just going to make it look like I'm dead enough. I'm not going to go to the nth degree, right? And for whatever reason, Huck is always thinking about how Tom could do whatever the scheme is better. So when we're looking at the two boys, they are what we call a foil. I'll go back. There we go. If you were in my freshman class, we briefly went over what a foil is. Does anyone remember? It's been a couple of years. Okay, a foil is when you take two characters and they are similar enough that you can compare them, but they contrast in like a really big way in that it highlights something about the other character. So they're a comparison where they're alike enough that, so they're two boys, right, so that's alike, and yet they contrast in a huge way. So in this way, Huck Finn is more of a realist, and Tom Sawyer is more of a romantic, right, and so that contrast there highlights particular ideas that the author has. So Mark Twain, hates romanticism, and in that way makes Tom seem ridiculous, right, in all of these romantic schemes. Whereas Huck Finn is more the realist and is like, yeah, sometimes you have to have schemes, but like for a purpose, right? And so we see that contrast throughout because he wants to point out that romanticism sucks. And remember that this is satire, and so he is kind of blowing that out of proportion using hyperbole, right, in order to create that. Besides this foil, Another place where he makes a dig at romanticists is at the sinking of the steamboat, right? So they come up to that steamboat wreck and there's like 3 dudes on it and they're like gonna leave the one for dead. Does anyone remember what that steamboat was named? I probably wouldn't either, but it's called the Walter Scott. And so Walter Scott is a romantic author who wrote Ivanhoe and a few other romantic tales, and so he has that boat sink named the romanticist's name just to kind of another dig at romantics, which is like funny if you're an old person and think that that's funny. So anyway, so you should know that Huck represents realism in this book and that Tom represents romanticism, and anytime that they're together we're going to see that interplay, and Mark Twain is going to have realism seem more reasonable than whatever the romantic antics are. Okay? Any questions on that stuff? Okay, something else that we want to note is that this story is very episodic in nature. In most stories, it kind of flows. The plot seems like a natural, just like a natural course, right? But in this one, it seems like there's like one event, and then another one, and then another one, and they're very episodic. And the reason that that is because this is a satire, right? So his purpose is to mock certain behaviors and concepts and things in society. And so he's just putting these little episodes in there to mock what he's trying to mock throughout. But he has like the thread of Huck Finn and Jim on the river to connect that. And so when you look at the episodes in this book, you should be thinking, why is this in here? What is he mocking in this particular episode? Either about America in general, about humanity in general, or about the South specifically. So some episodes from your last night's reading, there's the episode where they're talking about King Solomon. Does anyone remember that conversation? Can you give us a synopsis or what you remember?
So what I remember is Huck Finn is talking about kings in general, talking about King Solomon being really wise. And then Jim is saying, no, King Solomon wasn't wise. He was like crazy because he wanted to cut a baby in half.
Yeah. Okay. And who remembers the King Solomon story from the Bible? Like, can you give us, Grace, a brief synopsis of that story?
There was a lady who had a baby, or there were 2 ladies who had a baby. One of the babies died, and then one of the ladies like steals the other one's baby, and they go to King Solomon because they both claim that the baby's theirs. And King Solomon says, "Well, we'll cut him in half," and he changes the half. And one of the ladies is like, "Okay, that's fine." And the other one's like, "No, give it to her." And he knows who the mother is because the mother doesn't want their kid to die.
Yeah, I would rather be with this rando lady than dead, right? And so in that way, oh, he's very wise, right? Well, Huck and them are talking about this story, and Jim is like, no, he's a moron. Like, why would you do that? And he goes, A, he's not very wise because he had like 1,000 wives. And what kind of a man thinks that that's a good decision? Like, that's crazy, right? So that's kind of funny. And then he's like, but B, like, the only reason he's cutting this kid in half is not because he's wise, but because he has so many kids he doesn't care anymore, right? What's one kid among the others, right? This is a weird conversation. And you have to think to yourself, as like an active reader, why would Mark Twain have this conversation? What greater insight are we supposed to pull from that? Because there is like just some fun, anticky stuff, but this is a really weird, oddly specific conversation. So this is like one of those episodes. So does anyone have any idea why Mark Twain might be talking about this? Kind of a hard jump. So if you're thinking about the South and people who have millions of something that they seem not to care a lot about and are willing to sacrifice a few, is there an institution in America at this time? Yes.
Slaves?
The slaves, right? So Jim is coming, he is a slave. He's thinking about things from a slave perspective, and he's like, no, this guy is just like selfish. He's got so many kids, he doesn't care anymore. If we extrapolate that to American slavery at the time, people are bad slaves, are willing to kill a few because they have so many, they don't see them as people anymore. So we get kind of a little bit of a perspective on how Mark Twain thinks about the institution of slavery. And they're in Reconstruction at this point, so like Mark Twain, when he actually writes the book, we're past slavery, but he's looking back at the institution and just the treatment of Black Americans in general and pulling out some of these things. You should know that Mark Twain, he grew up in the South, but he really he really liked the black slaves that he grew up with and the black people. He would go and he would listen to their stories. He loved to hear their stories. And so he had a pretty progressive attitude about blacks and how we should treat people, despite the fact that he grew up in the American South. So that would be, so when he's talking about blacks in this book, he does it in a way that he tries to show us their value, right? Even though, and we'll talk about the use of the N-word later in this period, but even though that's in there a lot, he's not doing it to be condescending or rude. He's doing it to show certain aspects of the flaws of American society, okay? Another episode that is funny that comes right after King Solomon is the conversation about Frenchmen. Who remembers that conversation? Anyone? Yeah.
Just that Huck was telling Jim that the French people don't speak English, and Jim was like, no, they do.
Yeah.
And he was like, no, they don't.
He goes, you wouldn't be able to understand him, right? And he goes, what if I said to you, and this is Huck talking, parlez-vous français? And he's like, I'll smack you upside the head because nobody talks to me like that. He's like, no, that's just me saying, do you speak French, right? And so he's like, Jim is confused and doesn't really realize that there are other languages, because why would he, right? He doesn't have access to like education and things. Well then, Huck is like, well, okay, like, it does make sense. He's like, well, if he's a man, why doesn't he talk like a man, right? Jim is confused. And so Huck's like, well, do men talk like cats? And Jim is like, no. He's like, do they talk like cows? No. He's like, well then, it makes sense that a Frenchman would talk like a man. And Jim is like, okay, is a man a cat? And Huck's like, no, we just established that. He's like, is a man a cow? And again, Huck is like, no, again, we established that. He's like, is a Frenchman a man? And Huck goes, well, yeah. He goes, then why doesn't he talk like a man, right? And so his logic actually is a bit more sound than Huck's, right? Again, thinking about this is a weird episode. Why does he put it in there? What could we extrapolate from that? Any ideas? Okay, thinking about race and how people are treated during this time, how are race relations during this time? They are not so good, right? And thinking about the treatment and communication between different people, Jim thinks, we're all men, so we should all be treated that way, whereas Huck is very comfortable saying, no, there are differences in men. And in this case, like, obviously a language would be a barrier, but Jim is saying, you're saying that they're not equal, that they're not the same. And it would make more sense if we all communicated and treated each other the same than if we were over here, like, pretending like we're all different, right? And race is a social construct. It doesn't actually affect anything about you except for your skin color, right? It's like having brown hair or blonde hair or red hair, right? And so in that way, Mark Twain pulls out that thing that, like, we need to be treating each other better and more the same, and that we're more alike than we are different. And Jim seems to see that innately, the worth of a human person, right? Whereas Huck, because he's been a part of a society that has taught him that, sees these divides where there aren't any. Okay, so you should be asking yourself when you get to different episodes, why the crap is this in here? Because that's weird, right? So we'll see some tonight as you're reading. He meets people called the Shepherdsons and Grangerfords, and they're hilarious. They're like your like American hick family, and it's a weird episode. So you should be asking yourself, okay, why is this in here? What is Mark Twain trying to bring out? Okay. Another reason that these episodes are in here are to bring out motifs. Okay, and you probably have heard this word before, or at least you should have. I'm pretty sure I taught you when you were a freshman, but very briefly. So a motif is a word, concept, idea, behavior, image, or object that is repeated throughout a work, and it typically contributes to a text theme. Okay, it's different than a theme because a theme is like an idea or a belief that the author is trying to share with their audience, right? In the work of this book. Whereas a motif is just like something that's repeated, but because it's repeated, it's starting to show you certain things that then you can make into a theme, right? So when you read Great Gatsby, there's this motif of noses, where they talk a lot about people's noses, and often the people are looking down their nose at people, which then lends itself to a theme about social stratification in America and the class system. In this, you'll see a lot of motifs, and on your note page there, I've detailed a few for you. There's way more than that, but those are a few of the important ones. And so these episodes, because they're episodic, are they're thrown in there as part of these motifs that are then building. So you should be aware of that. Any questions on this stuff? Okay, I feel like we're going through like a bunch of things today, but they're important for your setup of this book. So we're going to talk about the use of the N-word in this book because it comes up over 200 times. And I think it's an important conversation to have about why we still read it, even though that very offensive word is in there. And so there's this documentary from 60 Minutes. It's pretty short, that talks about the use of the N-word, and there's this publishing company that wants to remove that and just put it out with the word slave instead, and just the conversation about what doing that would do for the book. So we're going to watch that and we'll discuss it afterwards, okay? I guess I can just see the question here. I'm having some technical difficulties because I forgot my computer and have to use the crappy school one. But, I mean, I guess the other one is still the crappy school one, but it's like a better crappy school one.
Wouldn't it be better if a leather hole
Really?
took a lock? With limited carry options, responsible...
That is a weird ad.
From the moment it was published in 1885, Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn caused controversy. It challenged authority, poked fun at religion, and was accused of leading children astray. What's surprising is that 125 years later, Huckleberry Finn is still making news. Today, there are school districts in America that ban this American classic for one reason, one word, nigger. A word so offensive it's usually called the N-word. As we first reported in March, a publishing company in Alabama says that schools don't have to change their reading list because they changed Huckleberry Finn. Their newly released edition removes the N-word and replaces it with slave. A bold move for what's considered one of the greatest works in American literature. The story will continue in a moment.
I don't know why it does that either on the YouTube, but
Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn is a classic set before the Civil War. The story's told by Huck, a white boy escaping an abusive father, and his adventures with a black man named Jim escaping slavery. Their journey takes place along the Mississippi River. In the book, Twain used the N-word 219 times. To some, the word gets in the way of the story's powerful message against slavery. To others, Twain simply capturing the way people talked back then. Are you censoring Twain?
We certainly are accused of censoring Twain.
Randall Williams is co-owner and editor of New South Books, publishers of the sanitized edition of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn that replaces the N-word with slave. It's aimed at schools that already banned the book, though no one knows how many have. Williams says they are not trying to replace Twain's original, N-word included.
If you can have the discussion, and you're comfortable having the discussion, have it. Have it with it in there. But if you're not comfortable with that, then here's an alternative for you to use. And I would argue to you that it's still powerful.
The new edition drew powerful reactions from Twain scholars, the press, and ordinary readers. And it's worth noting most of the articles don't spell out the word either. What's it say that people have been so passionate about it?
I think it says that race continues to be a volatile and divisive subject.
In this passage, Huck says the word 3 times in 2 sentences.
Jim was monstrous proud about it, and he got so he couldn't hardly notice the other niggers. Niggers come miles to hear Jim tell about he was more looked up to than any nigger in that country.
What do you think of Huckleberry Finn?
It's a great book. It's one of the greatest books in American literature.
Author David Bradley teaches at the University of Oregon. He says the key to understanding Huckleberry Finn is through Twain's use of language as the friendship between Huck and Jim unfolds.
When Huck comes back to that raft, he says, "They're after us." He doesn't say they're after you, he says they're after us. And that's the moment when it becomes about the American dilemma. It becomes about, are we going to get home?
School districts struggling to teach Huckleberry Finn have called in David Bradley. He believes strongly in teaching Twain's original text.
One of the first things I do is I make everybody say it out loud about 6 or 7 times. Get
The N-word.
Yeah, nigger, get over it. Now let's talk about the book.
Students at Woodbury High School in Minnesota read the original book this past school year, but there are differences in how their teachers approach it. Nora Weiss says the word out loud in class. Karen Morrill does not.
What happens when I say the N-word and I don't pronounce N-I-G-G-R? People are scared to talk about race.
Are you scared to talk about it in class?
No.
But you will not say out loud the N-word.
That's just such a minor part.
Aren't you giving the word more power than it deserves by not saying it?
I didn't give the word its power. It came into my classroom with that power.
Why is there a big deal about this right now? People find the word extremely offensive.
I might not always reach and nourish and nurture every single student, but I can certainly do my best not to harm them.
When Nora Weiss says the word, she feels its impact on students is worth it.
It makes sense in this novel to teach it with the controversy. It makes sense to bring up all of the hard emotions. They come with it. It's not just a classic book. It's not just the way the words are written. It's the ideas.
11th graders Melvin Efesoa, Joseph Jardio, and Ryan Farrow confronted the controversial word and their feelings about it.
I feel like that word is in there for a reason. Twain put the word in there to get our attention, and every time we read it, it does exactly that. It gets our attention.
If you replaced that with the word slave, of course people would be less bothered, but I think Twain wants people to be a little bit bothered.
Melvin, you smile.
I smile because, I just kind of think that the constant use of the N-word in there, to me, it feels unnecessary.
Why? What is it about? It's just a word, right? What is it about this word?
It reflects on African American history back then, and like I said, it's a history that nobody wants to relive.
Do you think the discomfort starts and stops with the N-word, or the discomfort extends to a conversation about race?
In this specific instance, it is the word itself that is the problem. People are not coming up and saying, well, we can't teach this book because it's got discussion about slavery. What they're saying is we can't teach the book because it's got all these repetitive instances of the offensive N-word in there, and therefore we're not going to use it.
The publisher says they're providing a service.
They are.
There are school districts that won't deal with Huckleberry Finn, and they remove this word, and now they're able to have their students read and deal with Huckleberry Finn.
No, it's not Huckleberry Finn anymore. We're talking about students. What are we teaching them? This may be their first encounter with slavery. It shouldn't be their only one. But that's one of the reasons we can't mess around with it. There is a reality there that you cannot avoid.
But do you lose their reality when you take out the N-word and replace it with slave?
Yeah. Slave is a condition. I mean, anybody can be a slave, and it's nothing for anybody to be ashamed of. But nigger has to do with shame. Nigger has to do with calling somebody something. Nigger was what made slavery possible.
Well, the word's poison.
You use the word?
Oh, I used to. I grew up saying the word. It was all I knew. I never gave it any thought.
Williams runs New South Books in Montgomery, Alabama, cradle of the Confederacy, and where Jim Crow was once king.
Well, there ain't the niggers going in this school. It's a white school.
Williams, a son of Alabama, says the civil rights movement changed him, as it did the rest of the South. For him, the subject of race and the N-word goes beyond any debate about the book. It's also about how far the South has come.
We learned to think differently about it, and thank God we did. I mean, the movement didn't just free, black Southerners. I mean, it freed white Southerners too.
Freed you from?
Freed us from the sin of, this was a big sin.
Kids use it, the rap artists use it, the black rap artists use it. As you know, as I well know, brothers use it all the time when they talk to each other.
I love it.
Sorry?
I love it.
You love it?
Yeah. Go ahead. You're a nigger, man. Look, in every group, there are words that you use, there are inflections, there is knowledge about what a word means to you or to me or how I mean it when I say it. That is not an insult. I think one of the things that offends white people about it is that they can't say it. They say, well, is it because of my inflection or is it because... And it's not because you're not us. Jeff Foxworthy says, you can't make jokes about a redneck unless you are one. You can't say nigger unless you are one. And unless you're willing to accept everything that goes with it, which is a lot of good stuff. And that's what they want. They want the good stuff.
What's the good stuff that goes with that word?
Having an awareness that your people have overcome centuries of oppression. The pride of saying, yeah, you can say anything you want and it won't slow me down one bit. But the word is hurtful. The word is not hurtful. How it is used is hurtful. The person who is saying is hurtful.
17-year-old Jeremy Richardson wrestled with how to react to the word, especially as the only black student in Nora Weiss's English class.
Having the teacher read it out loud to everyone, then everyone's looking at me like, oh, she just said that, what are you going to do about it? Like, I didn't really have a reaction. I basically ignored it.
You didn't have an external reaction?
Yeah.
Internally, though, what was going on?
Internally, I just thought about it like, this is wrong. Like, I don't think that she should be saying this out loud, or...
Well, why didn't you say something at that moment?
I don't know. Maybe because I didn't want everyone to see that I was having a problem with her reading the word. That may be it. But I definitely did have a problem with it.
That's an uncomfortable conversation for students.
It's uncomfortable for me, too. You saw that with Huck and Jim. So
Weiss spends 3 days in class talking about race even before starting Huckleberry Finn.
How did you balance your strong conviction about using the words that are in the book with the notion that some of your students may be pained by that word?
I don't have a callous view about the pain. I don't. But on the other hand, I do feel like any time you come up against something that creates tension or creates discomfort, it is a point at which you could grow. And I think that life in general has many, many moments like that. And I don't think that teaching kids to step away from that is healthy.
Is the argument that these kids should be subjected to pain? I mean, I don't see the point of that.
New South Books says it sold all 7,500 copies of the edited version of Huckleberry Finn and plans to print more in the fall.
The only thing missing from their, reading of this will be the word itself. Have we taken every bit of the value of Twain out? Well, that's a preposterous argument. I can't even see that argument.
What the publisher is saying, by introducing this new edition, they can still have a teachable moment and have the conversation about race. You look puzzled.
Well, you use the term teachable moment, and that's what nigga gives you. That's why it's important to keep it there. I call Huckleberry Finn a power tool when it comes to education. There are so many things that pry things open. It's like the jaws of life. You said a teachable moment. That teachable moment is when that word hits the table in the classroom, everybody goes, ooh, okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about where it came from. Let's talk about why you all went, when you don't go, about anything else. When y'all don't go, when it's blasted around in the parking lot in what y'all call music. If you take out everything in a book that causes the teachable moment, you have no teachable moments.
So let's talk about that. Do you guys have any reactions to that? What do you think? Do you think we should teach this book with the N-word in it, or do you think we shouldn't? Nathan, what do you think?
I think we should, because it's just a part of history.
Okay, so it should be in there just because of history. Hannah, what do you think? Should we teach this book?
I think yes, because he was right. Like, you don't get that reaction in one word.
Yeah.
That harsh. But that is also how people talk. So
Okay, it was like a real part of a southern reality, right? Where they were using that word and they were using it in that context. Any other thoughts about this? Yeah.
I almost feel like using that word is like a realist sort of a thing, because like if it's actually what happened, then Mark Twain isn't the kind of author to sugarcoat it.
Yeah. Yes, Grace.
I mean, I think that having a word in the book isn't necessarily problematic, right? But as a white person, you never have the right to say it. Because
Yeah.
it's been reclaimed by black people. And so I think, especially when that teacher says he makes everyone say it, I think that is not appropriate to tell kids you have to say this racial slur. when you don't feel that you have the right to. And that no white person should be saying it just because it's in a book or because you want to read it. There are alternatives you can say, and I think it being in the book is okay, but there's never an excuse to say a racial slur.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting because the man who says that, he is black himself, and so he, I feel like, has the right to treat it however he wants to, right? And you'll see that, 60 Minutes is very specific about the interviewer that they have, right? He's also black, so that he can ask them these tough questions without looking like he has a particular stance in that, right? Like, he's able to ask them those tough questions that I think a white person would not get away with asking, right? I will admit, in my first years, I think I was just a little bit, I don't know, just dumb, because I would read that word out loud because I was like, well, I don't want them to think that that I don't see the impact, but I think have matured over the years, and you guys are probably much more mature now than I ever was, but but I don't use that word now because I think it, even though that word has the impact, when I'm skipping over it as your teacher, you can see that it's there, right, and you can feel that impact, but I think that, it's not my place to say that, and I think it can be hurtful to people, and why would I ever want to do that to someone? But I do think that it's important that Mark Twain included it because I think if you just put slave there, we don't again get those feelings associated with how terrible it was that they treated Black Americans at the time in slavery. And so I think to take it out would be a disservice, but I think to say it would be not good either. So I think that that's an important conversation to have as we're reading it, because just to be aware of why it's in there and why we don't say it. Any questions or thoughts? Okay. The last thing that I want to talk about is dialect in the book. So, let me find. Okay. Getting real annoyed that I don't have my real computer. Okay, so there's a dialect use. Enjoy. Just look at your homework and stuff. It's online, so you're good. Okay, so in this book, Mark Twain uses a dialect, right? And he's one of the first authors to do this well. I think perhaps it was used in other things before, but this is the first mainstream thing. And remember that Mark Twain is one of our first American celebrities, right? And so his use of dialect here is interesting, and I want to talk about why he does it. This is just a picture of where in America different kind of dialects will come from. So you've got Rocky Mountain kind of sometimes has its own vibe. In the Northwest, I guess I didn't realize that we say things that are kind of different, but I think Utah sometimes is pretty similar to that, but in the Northwest we say you guys a lot, whereas down here it'd be y'all or all y'all, right, when you're referencing a group. Something else that is weird when I moved to Utah, I noticed that people here drop their G's a lot, and it almost sounds like a K. So they're I went skiing and then they'll say mountain instead of they'll kind of glottal over the NT of mountain. So I was you go skiing? It sounded like they were inking and I don't know. I just thought that was funny. So there are, obviously we speak a little bit differently. However, there's less spread within our country than there was in Europe at the time because we weren't so isolated for so long, right? We got to America, and not 100 years after that, you get pretty fast modes of transportation, which is why you get less differences in the languages, which is kind of cool. Anyway, that's not super relevant, but thinking about dialect in Huck Finn, why does he use dialect? Why does he employ those? What does that do for us and the story? What? Yeah, go for it.
Well, the way someone speaks is an important part of how you would see them, and so it helps you figure out what these kind of people are better.
Yeah, they're just more realistic in that way, right? Kind of having to do with realism, and seeing just kind of what that daily life would be like. He's got some different dialects, right? He talks about. Okay, go away. He talks about that in the author's note in I think he calls it the explanatory. Who talks differently than whom and why, because there's dialects, but I feel like there's a degree, yeah.
Jim and Huck, like, you can see very differently, but I feel like the way he wrote it, Jim has a very, like, thick accent.
Yeah.
With all the apostrophes, and you can see that he's skipping out letters and spelling things differently, because if you try to pronounce that, that's how you would say it.
Yeah. And why do you think that there's such a distinct difference between the way that Huck talks and the way that Jim talks? Yeah, like in race, in social class, right? You'll notice that the people who are more educated in this book talk more closely to like basic, like written English, right? Proper grammar and all that. And then the lower on the class scale that you get, the thicker their accents become. So in that way, he can show some social class there. Pap also has kind of a thicker accent than Huck because Pap is an uncivilized hick bumpkin dude, right? And so again, showing that class. It is a challenge to read this. Like I get that when you're reading to understand what is being said because it's being done more like by sound than it is by like proper grammar, right? So to help us / to have some fun, we're gonna play a game called Mad Gab. Has anyone ever played this before? Okay, it's very exciting. Get stoked. But basically, on one side of the card, there are like these little, I don't know, are those voice bubbles? Anyway, and it has words on here, and when you read them out loud, they sound not very easy. So like, Vine Danny Searway. And then you try and figure out what it's actually being said. Okay, so Vine Danny Searway. Vine Danny Searway. Vine Danny Searway. Anyway, you would read it, it actually is find an easier way, right? And so they're using other words that kind of sound like that. So this can help us a little bit with our dialect, but it's also just a fun class bonding experience as it's our first day together. So we're gonna split in teams. I think it's pretty even if we go this side of the room versus this side. And I'll have someone get up. The orange side is easier. We found out first period because they were reading the purple side and we had no idea what it was. Okay, but I will keep a timer and each side will get 1 minute to read through as many as you can, then you'll get the points for that, and then the other side will get a chance. You'll only guess on your side. Don't help the other team. We had some people who are like, oh, and I was like, shh, I want to help them, right? But we're going to play. This will help you to think about when you're reading, like Huck Finn and the dialect there. And also, because it's fun. And sometimes we need fun. So, thank you. Did everyone get a chance to put words like that? Excellent. Which side wants to go first?
We'll go first.
Excellent. And who wants to read first?
I can read first.